So this is the second session. This one's only going to run for about 25 minutes. So we have to be disciplined like we were in the last session, which is very good. Got two speakers. This is on the academic research and abolishing transport policy aims and also the wider environmental question. So we've got two speakers. We've got Pearce, researcher of sustainable mobility and transport decarbonisation, and Pearl Ahrens. Ahrens is actually Pearl Ahrens from the Fair Free London organising group. So I guess 10 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to go as quickly as possible. I'm going to talk a bit about. I'm just going to hold it, I think. So I'm going to talk a bit about the climate question, how that links with fares, and it's not as clear cut, I think, as the social justice. And so a bit like how the previous speaker from RT talked about the need to make sure the policy works with those communities. I think making sure it works on a green level is also important. So this image is the IPC when it was started. I'm going to talk about what that is, and that's what it is now. And it's just to say that we've come a long way in terms of our understanding of climate and how it links to some of these policies. Can I have the next slide, please? So I'm going to talk a bit about
Is that the right slide?
Yeah, that's the one. Thank you. So I'm going to talk a bit about what we know about climate change and what the government, what the policy decides whether or not we're on track, and how that works, and what's missing from an evidence basis, and then a bit of work I did as part of a team to try and close that evidence gap, particularly for London. Can I have the next slide, please? So it's all about how you decide what's sufficiently ambitious policy from a climate perspective. But if I wanted to sum up very briefly, it's a very complex topic, but I think it's important, what climate change is about. What we now know is that the Earth is a really complex sort of spider's web of interacting systems. Some of them human, some of them animal, some of them non-animal. And we've grown up at a point where we were a very small spider walking across this spider web. And so we've got used to things not really mattering what we do. So if you killed a load of megafauna one day, so big bison, the next day there was as many. And it was hard. So that goes from our biology, our psychology, and also how our society's developed in terms of not really needing to think about how our impact will then loop back on us. So we're now sort of big enough as a system, humans, that we're really straining all of these little wires in the web. Next slide, please. So what do we know about climate change? This is not what we knew when we started, but we now know that CO2 emissions, and including things like land change, which stops absorption of CO2, is the main driver. It's not the only one, but it's the vast majority. It's human CO2 in the atmosphere. And we now know that there's a non-negligible risk of Earth systems collapse. So that's not high risk at the moment, but it's on the table. That's the sort of stakes that we're at. And there's no safe, I'm sorry, it will get more positive. There is no safe level of warming. So a lot of people hear this 1.5, this 2 degrees, the limit. Unfortunately, that's sort of been plucked from the air. I can talk probably later about how those numbers came about. But there is no safe limit. But what we do know is that as you go past some of those numbers, the impacts and risks escalate exponentially. So as a goal, you know that every sort of fraction you go above, you're getting more and more risk. And finally, this sort of research component, science, has been able to sort of link how much CO2 we put out in the atmosphere and that number, that ultimate global average warming number. And that's what seems to happen. So it's the other thing to note is that CO2 doesn't go anywhere. In our lifetimes, it's all stuck in the atmosphere. It's very difficult to get back out. So anything we emit today is more or less it. There's a few techniques you can get some out, but basically it's about those emissions and how they accumulate. Next slide, please. I realise I'm going very fast, but I'm tight for time. So just a very brief history of climate change policy. So who are these acronyms, organisation acronyms that get chatted about. So we start with scientists beginning to observe something changing how the Earth operates. Skip a lot, and we get to 1992 when the UN started the UNFCCC, which is the body that sort of agreed that we should possibly maybe think about limiting this global warming. That's the first point that international policy decided that that should be a goal, with no details and no numbers, just working towards it. The Kyoto Protocol was signed in 1997, and the main thing that came out of that was a system of accounting for how we say who's responsible for what CO2 and how we account and monitor and measure that. There are challenges in that we'll come to. Next year after that, IPCC was set up. Now, they are a body that collates scientific data. They don't make any science. They just look at what's already happening in academia, in government research, and they collate it. So anything that there's no sort of driving force for what research do we need from them. It's just literally, this is what's been done, and they present it to policymakers. Skipping forward a little bit, 10 years, if my maths is right, yes. We have the UK Climate Change Act, which was the first global act to really set these limits of budget. So this is what we call a carbon budget, which I'll come back to in a second. But they sort of say, in this 5-year period, the UK government, on the accounting system designed by the Kyoto Protocol, you have to limit your amount of emissions in each that 5-year block to this number. And it sets up a body, which we'll come to in a minute, which is the CCC, and they set these budgets, and they also advise on other climate-based targets. And then we give a lot of time again, 2015, which is coming up for 10 years ago. And that's the first agreement of a number. And we have this wishy-washy statement in the Paris Agreement, which is that we're aiming for 2 degrees, but we should be exploring the opportunities to reach 1.5. Very interesting story as to how that happened. It wasn't the Western nations, it was the nations at risk that really pushed for that. Next slide, please. And while we wait for that, I just put that up just to give an example of everything, how complex the interactions are when they're modeling climate. So this is kind of how climate policy works at the moment. You start with what's happening on the ground, your London mayor's transport policies, whatever they are, and policies that don't look climate, like, I don't know, the policing strategy. And they'll all have an impact on what the yearly emissions are and an impact on the longer term emissions, and they all add up. And you then have this relationship where you know how much you are likely to put out in the atmosphere and therefore how much warming. Whereas a lot less work, which is what I'm going to come to, is this link back. So this going, actually, well, we kind of know where we want to be, and we want to know what the local policies are. And particularly for sort of subnational, like the Mayor of London, or even a multinational, like a company, it's very difficult to actually say, well, that is Paris Agreement compliant, that is on track to where we've said we're going to be globally or not. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk a bit, I think, about the budgets, just as an example. This is to scale, by the way. So this is an estimate of the amount of budget we could have emitted over human lifespan of emitting carbon into the atmosphere to cap at 1.5, a 50-50 chance of meeting 1.5, incidentally. And this is to scale. So this is the remaining global budget that they estimate we have. And what the CCC does, the UK body that advises, is they take that global budget and they say, okay, this is how many people live in the world. We'll take the UK's population share of that remaining budget and then aim to that. Now, some people have laughed. Part of the issue with that is that big already used section takes a lot of UK emissions, more than our fair share globally. So the question is that fair? It also doesn't account for capability. So the UK might be more able to reduce emissions than other places. And they then model this and they advise, and I've put in red some sprawling sort of questions about how that actually works, particularly around this accounting system. So if, for example, because electric cars have come up, electric cars usually aren't manufactured in the UK, and so their emissions for manufacture are counted on somebody else's budget. So there's challenges and issues there. Next slide, please. So this comes to this piece of work that we did. So we took just the cars in Greater London, and I can't remember the baseline year, I think it's 2019, and we say what happens now under these different policy scenarios, and how does that add up to the cumulative budget that is set. So CCC 1.5 pathways share that I talked about in that top light green one. And then the bottom light green one is another research institute's estimate of something that might be considered fairer or less risky. So that's a much tighter budget to account for that. And what we essentially found through all of these, did a lot of different policies we looked at heavy electrification, we looked at lightweighting, which is just sort of like limiting how many SUVs you're allowed to be manufactured, all those sorts of things. And what we found is that the only lever that really got us anywhere close to these budgets was anything between severe and highly severe reduction of car use across London. Next slide, please. Right. So the conclusion here from this work is that electrification isn't enough, because you still got the emissions that come from manufacturing, but even within that, it's too slow. And the number is like 85% drop in car use. So that's really quite severe from where we are now. We're not on track from that with current London policies. And then on the free public transport fares, the real question for me is how much that as an offer allows you to do some of the climate bans that we talked about. Because you're not going to get anywhere with carrot only. We kind of know that from the research. And you need to be getting to the point where you're actually sort of limiting car use. And the question is, does this help build the public support for the necessary climate change? So we had a question about strategy, about whether you should or shouldn't link those things directly. I'm sure we can have a discussion, but I'm aware of time. So,
which is fantastic and terrifying. So Drew has said that we need to do something drastic to meet fair carbon budgets that are realistically going to slow or stop climate change. And he suggested some of the solutions might be free public transport. And his paper also suggested road user charging. We've been having some conversations about road user charging here today, and also amongst us in the organising group, because although the public are very positive overall about free public transport, some people say to us, how are you going to pay for it? And road user charging is an obvious method to pay for it, because it's a very neat way to discourage driving while encouraging public transport use. It's kind of two sides of the same coin. So in this way, it's very clear what the choice is. Every time you need to go somewhere, one mode of transport is cheaper for you than the other one. So some of that road user charging income would also have to go into improvements to the service. That is absolutely vital, as Dan was saying and Lisa was saying, because just when you introduce free public transport and have no other changes, so far the evidence is that driving doesn't reduce. Improvements have to be things like more routes, more frequent services, and more reliable services. These are things that people say will make them switch from driving, and that's always been a part of what we're fighting for at Fair Free London. So what if we were to answer, how are you going to pay for it with road user charging? What are the implications for the campaign? That's one of the questions that we want to answer today. We'd be more sure to get that much from driving, that we said is so important for stopping climate change. And it's a decent answer to the question, how are you going to pay for it, that people can understand. However, we've been a bit worried about stating it very clearly as a single funding solution, as Simon was saying. Because although it's not very popular with the public, statistically speaking, it's even more unpopular with politicians who are super scared of implementing road user charging. Think Cambridge, New York City, they both said they were going to do it, they proposed it, and then they suddenly backed out in the last couple of years. I do just want to take a moment to doubt the premise of the question, how are you going to pay for it? I think it has an inherently austerity framing. Even people who say they support the idea of free public transport, they can't think outside of this deficit mentality. And something that we were talking about the other day, we're paying for not having free public transport right now, in terms of excess deaths and illness from automobility. And all the other support for mobility, it costs a lot of money for the government, but also we're all paying for tickets at the moment. So maybe the question should be, how much money would that save me? But back to the original question. Say we didn't want to go with this road user charging answer and we outsource that issue to another campaign to take the political flak. What are the other methods that we could suggest to the mayor to pay for free public transport? I mean, Lisa's already said loads of them. Simon's wrote loads in his briefing. Some of them are stuff like land value capture that TfL could do right now, but a lot of them, they would need central government support, either to do that action or to give powers to the GLA to be able to do that. So the payroll tax, the GLA would need extra powers. To change the council tax system to something less regressive, the GLA would need powers. And yeah, the central government, they could do different payroll tax, they could stop road building, they could charge more for fuel duty or charge more for aviation fuel, for tax and aviation fuel. So that's kind of what this session is about. We don't want to pick a particular one necessarily, but we do want to kind of strategically weigh up some pros and cons and also think about how we would integrate climate policy into this campaign.